1252nd day of the war. Trump has reduced the time taken by Putin to make peace with Ukraine for up to 10-12 days. Apparently, he was told that Russia is continuing to take time in negotiations and does not think of making a deal for real. Maybe he's just looking for any way to switch public attention from the unpublished recordings of the organizer of PARALYZES, Jeffrey Epstein, in which Trump himself allegedly appears. Either way, the new term of the ultimatum does not leave Putin with any chance of achieving serious success at the front line until his expiry. Ukrainian drones have hit another railway station, this time in the Volgograd region. The war has also once again entered the cyberspace. Pro-Ukrainian Belarusian hackers have paralyzed the work of Aeroflot. The company network has remained without serious protection systems due to sanctions. Well, old good stupidity has given way. The systems of airlines have been working on Windows XP and the passwords have not changed for years. Russia is still losing equipment and soldiers. The units are dying up to 95% of losses. Cemetery of Russian equipment is being discovered in all new directions, and Russian tanks with Sarmangal demonstrate the inability to fight with normal tanks. One of them, after being spat at by a Ukrainian machine, crawled to rear, where he was finished off by FPV drones. The joy of the Russian world, like the lack of water in the occupied territories. Marauders have been added. Some people, similar to the Almatovs, systematically open apartments in Gorlovka. It is time for General Ludnov to contact and inform that they resigned 2 months ago. In the Primorsky territory, a veteran of the SVO was allowed to work with children. He has 7 felony charges for robbery, theft, fraud, and hooliganism. He will prepare school children for the patriotic game Zornitsa and teach them the basics of military medicine. This is the new Russian normality. About this and much more in today's Fresh Report. You can support it with your like, comment, and subscription to the channel. All these actions help promote the video. Especially your subscriptions are important for YouTube algorithms. US President Donald Trump announced that he was once again very disappointed in Vladimir Putin. Therefore, Trump has reduced the time to implement secondary sanctions against Russia partners from 50 days to 12 days. New conditions come to effect today. There is no point in waiting. It was 50 days and now it will be 10-12. I would like to be generous, but we just don't see any progress, Trump said at a meeting with the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Keir Starmer. The US president added that he had already talked to Putin 4 or 5 times, but the negotiations did not help to reach an agreement. Officially, Trump intends to announce a new term for concluding the peace in Ukraine today or tomorrow. This is a quote. He also stated in response to the question of the possibility of meeting with Putin that he is no longer too interested in negotiations. I don't know, he said. You see, I'm no longer interested in talks, he said. And we have such cute conversations, such respectful conversations, and then the next night people die when the missile flies into the city and strikes it, he said. Apparently, Trump has finally begun to listen to sane members of the administration, who told him about the result of Istanbul negotiations, on which Russia apparently again brought in impossible conditions with the transfer of 4 areas, the reduction of the Ukrainian army, and the actual restriction of sovereignty of Ukraine. If Trump does not change the terms again, in the big picture at least, we have not long to wait to understand whether Trump's plan to introduce sanctions against buyers of Russian energy companies will work. As I said, sending Medinsky to negotiations, especially when Ruda and Trump expressed clear displeasure that this clown represents Russia, is a big mistake. Well, and Melania again took the attention of the US president to the continued terrorist shelling of Ukraine from Russia. Here, it must be said that many, of course, perceive this with skepticism, well, because Trump has already said a lot, he constantly changes his opinion, and so on, and so on. And these reproaches are quite fair, and I quite share them, and I quite assume that in 10-12 days we will hear that we need to give another chance, that something else, in short, well, you know Trump no worse than me, and you know my attitude to him. Since November last year, I say that this is a horror in general from the point of view of support for Ukraine, and that Trump is worse than possible options. At the same time, Trump acts above my expectations and expectations of many other people, but the most important thing is what I would like to draw your attention to. Despite the fact that every time we talk about the fact that Trump changes his opinion, Trump is not consistent, Trump is emotional and so on, this canvas of the last 1.5, probably, months is quite linear. Well, that is, there was no such thing that Trump said and said for the last 1.5 months that he was annoyed with Putin, that he was tired of Putin and so on, and then suddenly began to say that he respected Vladimir again and that Putin is good at all. There was no such thing. The only thing that came out of this narrative, which was the last 1.5 months, is the stop of the help for Ukraine, but we have already dealt with it. This is Pete Hex and one of his deputies. It's a pity that they still remain in their places. I would very much like to get rid of these Ukrainophobes in the American establishment, in the American White House. But nevertheless, the fact remains a fact. Trump has been quite consistent lately in relations with Russia, and not only him, but his team. This is what Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham are talking about, who is perceived and is one of the main supporters of Ukraine among American politicians. But at the same time, do not forget that he is a good comrade of Trump, who is always praises Trump, with whom they communicate, with whom they interact, with whom they play golf, and so on. Therefore, in principle, I like his new movement. Moreover, let's be honest, if what Trump said were not Trump, well, no one of us would have signed under these words. He finally came to the point where he said, I don't see any point in talking to Putin because these conversations do not give anything. Yes, it's late, yes, after 3.5 years there's already more war and so on, but nevertheless, this is an absolutely healthy position. This is an absolutely adequate position. Yes, Trump came to it himself, well, in the sense that he kind of spent time without helping Ukraine, without pressing on Russia. He spent time to come to this and all that, although there. What is called good rulers in principle, people learn from other people's mistakes instead of creating their own, but nevertheless, the point in which he is now is a rather adequate point. Another question is what can he do from this point? Yes, that is, we heard assessments, including from the side of Besant and from the side of many other people in the environment of Trump, that the sanctions that were with Biden are nonsense, that in fact these sanctions were 3 from 10. And in fact you can introduce sanctions much harder on 7 from 10, on 8 from 10. How much does this have to do with reality? The question is open. Well, that is the US really ready to impose an embargo on India, on China, and on Brazil in order to pressure Russia? In this regard, I was very much pleased, probably the wrong word, but I was inspired by the reaction of India, which said that, in principle, well, we don't really need Russian oil. If anything, we will refuse it. This is the only, perhaps, reaction, a manifestation that showed that, indeed, it was really possible to make a serious blow to Russian energy sales. Which will make a bad economic situation in Russia, which, by the way, Trump also says, will make it much worse. Here, in any case, we once again note the positive dynamics of Trump's perception. The second thing is that we hope that he will implement the threats that he says because, at least, we saw how it works, for example, with Iran. Well, the third thing, of course, it needs to take off a hat, a separate one, in front of the Russian officials, who do everything possible to make Trump really act aggressively. For example, this time Dmitry Medvedev was such a person who literally tried to call Trump's bluff. I can't say that I'm some kind of psychologist, but I can definitely say that trying to take Trump lightly is a bad idea. Well, not because he's really a thoughtful and cunning person, but because he has the perception of the world as a child. Well, that is, even if some situation causes negative consequences for America itself, but Trump will believe that it concerns him personally and his self-love will be affected. Then he will try to do this, well, that is, because he has such a perception of the world, he is not a fool, he is kind of a person quite infantile, narcissistic. In this sense, they are very similar with Putin. So another thank you to Dmitry Medvedev that he's being reckless. I must say that in America he is perceived as quite an official figure. So for a second, the secretary of the Russian Security Council and the former president. And it's being perceived his words as a personal attack, perceives his words as a person who throws Trump a challenge. Well, good luck with this. What can be said? In the meantime, the American aid continues to expand in Ukraine, the American-German company, the developer of software, and he promised until the end of the year to supply in Ukraine 33,000 AI kits for kamikaze drones, reports Financial Times. Some wrote about this news as the fact that they will supply the drones. It's not true, they will supply special kits for drones. The supplies will be delivered as part of the contract with Pentagon for a total of $50 million. Supplied kits Skynote, intended for UAV equipment with manual control of the machine vision system, allowing you to enable automatic guidance to the target at a distance of up to 1 kilometer while facing electronic warfare interference. Means this technology of machine vision inside the drones, well, which are obviously Americans, have more capabilities. That is, everything that is connected with the technical performance of high-tech is clearly better for America than for Ukraine and than for any other country in this world. Yes, Ukraine has made great progress further in the production of cheap drones, cheaper drones than the United States. So this experience Ukraine will exchange with the States, it will be a super deal that was announced by Zelensky. But everything that related to the technological complex systems, of course, American companies are at a more advanced level. And the combination of these two parameters can give a significant advantage. At the output we should get FPV drones on which the electronic countermeasures does not work. More precisely, well, it works until a certain moment when it starts to work and suppress, the machine vision turns on and the drone itself strikes a certain target. We have already seen this somewhere a year ago. Also, Sergei Cernenko demonstrated prototypes, some movements in this direction. But when it will be systematic, when it will be, let's say so, at a more advanced level, because I understand that the main limitations were in the fact that this machine vision captured only the target itself and not a specific. I don't know, a specific point in which it is necessary to hit, because it is not enough for you to just hit the tank, you need to hit a specific place of the tank. Well, in general, I certainly don't know any details. I'm sure that all these technical details are very much hidden, and a lot is done so that they do not leak into open access, but I believe that this direction is very promising. Ukraine, for the first time, received gas from Azerbaijan on a new route. First, this gas supply was carried out under the Trans-Balkan corridor through Romania and Bulgaria. It is said in the press release of Naftogaz. Naftogaz concluded a deal about the supply of Azerbaijani gas from Sakar Energy Ukraine by the state of the oil company of the Azerbaijani Republic Sakar. As at the beginning of July, wrote the publisher RBK Ukraine with a reference to the analytic of the company Pro Consulting, Michael Switch, the volume of gas and text operations on the Trans-Balkan corridor is about 160 cubic meters per day. According to experts, now Ukraine is mostly importing gas from Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. The supply of Azerbaijani power plants is becoming more and more important as Europe is trying to refuse Russian exports, and it is very good that Ukraine is getting the opportunity to join the new energy security system. But also the serious consequences of Russia's loss of influence in the post-Soviet space. It is obvious that Baku no longer cares about the reaction of the Kremlin. The only truly negative moment in Europe will now have to close its eyes on the violation of human rights in Azerbaijan to fight against Russia, which is committing a real genocide. Politics is always a choice of less evil, which of course does not cease to be evil, but here it is necessary to agree that Europe is already doing this because Azerbaijan replaced including oil Russia's supplies for European countries. About 71.4% of all defense purchases come to Ukrainian arms, said the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. For comparison, in the same period of year 24, this figure was only 44.1%. The most dynamic development is in the direction of unmanned systems. More than 95% of the funds allocated to the purchase of drones are directed to the Ukrainian manufacturer. Numbers, of course, are impressive, but this does not mean that more than two-thirds of all weapons coming to the front are Ukrainian production. Deliveries of ammunition and air defense systems are not taken into account here, which are manufactured within the Western defense industry and are purchased in the third countries. On the other hand, it seems that orders are not taken into account here, which are placed by Western countries on Ukrainian defense enterprises in the interests of the Ukrainian defense forces. According to the so-called Danish model, one way or another, it must be acknowledged that Ukraine's defense industry continues to strengthen, even though the Russian Ministry of Defense keeps reporting that it is destroying almost all Ukrainian defense enterprises on a daily basis. If we count all the reports of the Russian Ministry of Defense about how many Ukraine's defense industry objects they have hit, it turns out that they have hit somewhere, well, 4 to 5 times more than ever existed in Ukraine, and even in the times of the Soviet Union. Russia uses drone interceptors, but not to protect military or infrastructure objects, but personally for Vladimir Putin. A video was posted online of Putin's bodyguard with a drone interceptor. It was shot on May 9. Ukrainian military analyst and expert on drones of Russia Sergei Skresno, Flash, on Monday posted a video on which it is assumed that Vladimir Putin's security officer holds a drone interceptor. The details of the video indicate that it was shot after the victory parade on May 9, according to the analysis agency. The object that can be seen in the hands of a man is similar to the drone interceptor, Yoka. This is a kinetic drone that launches multiple catapults to destroy drones such as Baba Yaga, FPV drones, BPA scouts, UAVs of the airplane type, and loitering munitions, the Russian newspaper wrote. Video of the use of the drone Yoka was published by military channels. It is interesting that over time, the appearance of this interceptor by Putin's security and almost 3 months have passed, we have not seen any signs of scaling their production, which is now taking place in Ukraine. However, if the value of such drones has reached the FSO, then sooner or later it will reach the Ministry of Defense. Therefore, Ukrainian designers and military responsible for deep strike need to develop countermeasures now. For example, a rear-view camera with a machine vision giving the drone a command to maneuver. Moreover, such a system has already been tested on Russian reconnaissance drones. True, it does not give good results, but at least the direction of the movement is clear. In the meantime, in Moscow, they found an even more effective solution for the struggle with UAVs. Protry Artemy Vladimirov ended the service with a special bell ringing which deafens all UAVs. According to the priest, only the bell helps to fight UAVs working with fiberglass. The prophecy of the Protry was heard on July 26 in the temple of the chief triumvirate on Shavlovka. Nevertheless, more tangible measures to protect Moscow are also being taken, says Radio Liberty. Amid Ukrainian drone attacks, Russian forces built dozens of new air defense positions in the summer of 2025, along the central ring road Tisked, and doubling its small concrete, built in Soviet times, a route designed to provide transport of missiles to the systems of air defense of Moscow. Often new Russian positions of the air defense in the Moscow region are located next to the former positions of the Soviet small ring of the air defense, which was designed to protect the city from air attacks of NATO countries with the help of S-25 Berkut missile systems. It should be remembered that each shell on the ring around Moscow, it is the absence of a panzer system near a military plant, an oil refinery, or a key railway junction, somewhere else in Russia. So the strengthening of the Moscow Air Force can only be welcomed. Moreover, it still does not interfere with paralyzing Moscow airports with constant flights of drones. So yes, Vladimir Vladimirovich, please bring all the air defense to Moscow. Moscow is not Russia. Defend it as you like. This will help Ukraine to make more effective strikes on Russian defense industry objects on the rest of the country's territory. Putin, who has been leading the cyber war against Europe for years, and Ukraine have shown that this game can be played together. Moreover, Russia is much worse protected from such attacks due to sanctions. Hackers have paralyzed the work of Aeroflot. One of the reasons for the break could be the unchanging 3-year-old password of the general director. Aeroflot on Monday morning reported a failure in the operation of its information systems, after which it canceled 57 pair of flights from its main headquarters in Sheremetyevo. The Ukrainian Belarusian hackers took the responsibility for what happened. The prosecutor general confirmed the connection between the cyberattack and the failures. Among the vulnerabilities that allowed them to break the Aeroflot system, the hackers noted the unchanging 3-year password of the CEO of the company, Sergei Alexandrovsky, and the sanctions have nothing to do with it. Aeroflot reported a failure to enter the infrastructure at about 8 a.m. After that, the airline announced the cancellation of 57 flights from Moscow in the opposite direction. According to the online table of Sheremetyevo, the company canceled flights in 25 cities of Russia, as well as in Yerevan, Minsk, Tashkent, and Astana. The first canceled flight was scheduled for 8:35 a.m. later, on July 29 at 19:20. The Air Force's operation was almost completely paralyzed by a hacker attack. Telegram channel Aviatorkina reported it, with a link to the transport workers. Computers do not work absolutely everywhere, neither in Sheremetyevo nor in the Natspor offices. All systems were down, there are no flight plans. They can't even refuel the plane, the channel words of the source retorted. The employees were forbidden to use corporate mail and working computers, and Telegram was advised to be used for communication with the authorities. Aviatorkina was noted. For some reason, it was not Messenger Max. The airline clarified that changing the tickets is made only for specific categories of passengers, among which the participants of the so-called SWO were noted. Aeroflot promised to transfer part of the Aeroflot flights to subsidiary companies Russia and Pobeda, which work according to the schedule. From 8 to 12, Aeroflot managed to perform more than 40 flights from Sheremetyevo, the Ministry of Transport reported. President Dmitry Peskov called the cyberattack on the airline quite alarming. After almost 5 hours, the Prosecutor General's office confirmed that the reason for the Aeroflot failure was a hacker attack. According to the department, a criminal case has already been initiated under Article 272 of the Criminal Code. The groups of hackers, Silent Crow, and cyber partisans of Belarus took responsibility for the attack. The first pro-Ukrainian group declared itself only in January by breaking up of the registro and theft of the database of a single real estate register with a volume of 2 billion lines. The second group has been fighting Alexander Lukashenko since 2020. Silent Crow has reported that during the operation it was completely compromised and destroyed the Aeroflot IT infrastructure. According to the hackers' statement, they have been within the corporate network of the airline for a year. During this time, they managed to download a full database of flight history, get access to the employees' computers, copy the data from the service servers and the surveillance system for personnel. According to Silent Crow's assessment, the damage from the operation is strategic, and the restoration of the lost IT infrastructure will require perhaps tens of millions of dollars. Hackers have promised to publish the data received in the near future. We look forward to it. Our partisans of Belarus said on their website that the operation became possible thanks to the fact that old versions of Windows were used in the company, and some employees neglected the security of passwords. So the general director of Aeroflot, Sergei Alexandrovsky, did not change the password since 2022, said in the group. What happened to Aeroflot clearly shows error, import substitution, says the director of Internet Protection Society, Mikhail Klimerev. If you refuse the service of the leading world vendors, you have to replace their services with something, he wrote. You have to look for a replacement in companies that lack competence because really cool specialists will leave and real competencies are unavailable due to sanctions, the expert clarified. That said, I wouldn't discount plain human error, as we saw in the Aeroflot case, is turned to the maximum. Before we move on, let me remind you that you can also support the channel financially. You can do this on Patreon, the link to which is in the description, or by buying, and rather buy NVPN. This is a tool to bypass blockages that are built by the Russian state. Watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, use Instagram, go to blocked media, use Steam, use Discord. Steam is not blocked yet, but periodically some servers, some games like fall because Roskomnadzor shoots everywhere. You may have noticed that many VPNs stopped working because Roskomnadzor is now actively hunting, actively trying to silence them. We are still dealing with all the attacks that are coming at us, so NVPN is a good choice for you if you need a stable VPN. The link to the purchase in the description. Buying it, you support this channel and remind you that in Russia it is legal to buy VPNs and use VPNs. Even with this new law on the search for extreme materials, it is separately emphasized in all kinds of notes inside all kinds of state departments that there is no ban on VPNs in this law, and I hope it will not appear. Well, if something changes, of course we will let you know, but for now, buy a VPN by the link in the description. Ukrainian drones continue to attack Russian railroad logistics. On the night of July 27, in the village of Oktyabsko in the Volgograd region, UAVs attacked an electric substation near the railway. On the photo and video that were published later, it was noticeable damage to a service building at Yutovo station. Researcher Tataragami believes that a signal equipment was placed in the damaged building, providing the movement of trains on this section of the railway. Searchers note that the building completely burned down, therefore all equipment was destroyed. According to the information of Governor Andriy Bakarova and the Southern Transport Prosecutor's Office, as a result of the strike, the power supply to the overhead contact line was also disrupted, which led to the delay of several trains. In the evening of July 27, the movement of trains was restored, reported in the Telegram channel of the Privolzhskaya Railway. As usual, the details of the blows made in the previous days continue to appear. Ukrainian drones successfully hit the production power of the Kharkov powder plant, completely destroying one of the buildings. Satellite image as a result of the strike was published by the Telegram channel Exale Nova. The enterprise located in the Tambov region of the Russian Federation was attacked on July 25, Militarny reminds. Judging by the fresh pictures, the plant is actively expanding its power. New production buildings are being constructed on its territory. This is not the first attack on the facility. A previous strike was reported in June of this year. The distance from the Ukrainian state border to the Tambov gunpowder plant is about 360 km. The Kharkov gunpowder plant produces more than 200 products, including paraxylene gunpowder for firearms, hand grenades, shots for grenade launchers, as well as artillery and mortar ammunition. The enterprise is part of the state corporation Rostec. It is unknown whether the recent attack affected the plant's operations and the volume of its output, and if it did not affect, then in the near future you can expect a new visit of Ukrainian drones. But this is quite a significant destruction. These are not just broken windows. In the Rostov-Nizhny Novgorod regions there were fires at the military training center of the engineering troops. In the Rostov region, a fire has been recorded from the sides of the Filipenko and Krasnovka in the Kamensky district. Next to them is the Bordanovsky training ground, 11th Separate Guard Engineering Brigade. On the NASA firm's map, a fire is also displayed at the location of the training ground. Another fire in the city of Kastov, the Nizhny Novgorod region. According to the information of the Ukrainian Telegram channel, Supernova Plus, a major fire took place on the territory of the military object. There is located the 210th Intermediate Regional Training Center of the Engineering Troops, Military Unit 641. Management of the Ministry of Emergency Situations in the Nizhny Novgorod region reported to the media about the fire in the garage at the intersection of Enthusiasts. There is also a military center. It is not known what the cause of the fire was, Ukrainian drones, divers, or just someone smoked where it got. The news agree pleasant. We will hope that there will be more such fires. Project Vorokheyev publishes already an archive video of combat actions in the area of the village of Kondrativka in the Sumy region, about the liberation of which by the fighters of the 255th Separate Assault Regiment. We talked to you in the days. Apparently, the defended village of the Russian military from the 30th Infantry Regiment really tried to get out of the encirclement. However, it succeeded, as they say, not only to all. Vorokheyev describes the video as follows. Aerial scouts found a Russian infantry group of 10 people who managed to remain unnoticed for a long time thanks to the fog. Subsequently, a combined strike was inflicted on them with the use of artillery and FPV drones, the area of the village of Kondrativka, Sumskaya Oblast. Apparently, the Ukrainian command seriously took care of the crisis that is developing in the Pokrovske region, and I want to say thank God, one of the newly created corps is being redeployed there, and not a simple one but an airborne assault corps, meaning an elite unit. And judging by the words of his commander, he understands the basics of modern warfare well. The first task of the newly created 7th Corps of Rapid Reaction Air Assault Corps is defense of Pokrovsk, where intense fighting is currently taking place for control of the suburbs. This was reported by the commander of the corps, Colonel Evgeny Lysychuk, in an interview for Army Inform. Responding to the question of readiness of the unit, the commander noted that the corps had already been formed and served as a command unit, and its brigades performed combat tasks on one of the most difficult sections of the front. Higher military command has already determined the zone of responsibility on the front line for the 7th Corps under the command of Lysychuk. I can't tell you everything, but it's probably about the hottest direction of the front, the defense of Pokrovske. We will complete all the tasks, said the Corps commander. Airborne brigades were included in the formation, the 25th, 77th, 79th, 81st, as well as the 78th Airborne and Assault Regiment. The creation of new units and regiments is planned in the future. If you, like me, immediately remembered the problems with the newly created Ukrainian brigades at this point, then you can catch your breath. Most likely it is about the units that provide the functioning of any corps. It is probably about the anti-aircraft, engineering, unmanned, and other regiments which are already in the composition of other corps. It is known that the 25th Airborne Brigade is already holding the defense in Pokrovsk itself, which is confirmed by the publications of its press service. The rest of the units until recently acted on other sections of the front. Lysychuk emphasized that in the process of forming the corps, he is making a bet on the development of the unmanned component. The basis for this will be the 25th Brigade, which has experience in the use and deployment of a tech airborne. The assault group does not go into battle alone, but shoulder to shoulder with unmanned systems and robotic complexes. The element of the tech airborne is implemented across all brigades and units that actively carry out combat actions, he says. The main reason for this prioritization is the decreasing relevance of using armored vehicles, since the enemy keeps rear areas at a depth of 15-20 kilometers from the front line under fire control. Therefore, in his opinion, the most relevant direction now is the development of unmanned and robotic systems. They can perform various tasks: fire strike, the use of machine guns, the installation or demining of engineering barriers, breaching of passages, and so on. We use robots widely. This is both combat work and fire destruction and logistical and engineering tasks. They can mine and demine. This is a robot kamikaze that do an important thing. They come in where the assault or sapper group can no longer penetrate to destroy the object, bridge, or shelter. It is thanks to robots that we successfully perform such tasks. I believe that it is extremely important now to use technology on the battlefield. As a rule, air assault corps perform offensive actions and assaults. And it is extremely important to perform this not only due to the heroism and courage of the paratroopers, but also with the help of technology, including artificial intelligence. We actively implement it. Only with the help of such a complex approach you can show high results, he summed it up. When it says, well, like the military that commands the corps, it gives me incredibly pleasant, generally wonderful feelings. Because usually we hear this from volunteers, from analysts, and so on. And military inside any army is quite quite conservative. And therefore, what he says imposes on me hope that it will really be possible to break the situation in the Pokrovske direction. Deployment of air assault corps looks more than timely because the situation in the Pokrovske direction is not improving. Deep State notes the advance of the Russians in the Popov and Yar district. Here the Russian troops provide a flank of their own offensive on the supply line along the Pokrovsk-Dobropolye highway. Ukrainian military officer Alexander Salenko believes that Russian armed forces are still trying to capture Rodinskoye and cut the supply line of the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration. According to him, the Russian infantry is applying a new tactic, which is to sink into the depths of Ukrainian positions. About this tactic connected with the major Russian losses was recently told in Deep State, and Salenko explains what it is dangerous for the defense forces. Thus, the danger for Ukrainian logistics, the drone units and mortars, as well as the risk of friendly fire increases. In addition, the attention of Ukrainian drone operators is getting distracted by monitoring its own frontline area, to the detriment of operations against Russian positions and rear areas. In addition, it marks large losses of the enemy when trying to move through open fields and anti-tank rumble. However, it is believed that the Russian command deliberately goes to such losses in order to preserve the pace of the offensive, because in the event of a possible pause and stabilization of Ukrainian defense, it will be more difficult to break through it. On the Lyman direction, the Russians suffered major losses in armored vehicles and artillery during the crossing through the pontoon, the military says. The corresponding photo was posted on Twitter by a sea infantryman nicknamed Craig Forsher. Only on one crossing, the enemy lost the BM-21 Grad anti-aircraft missile system, as well as the M100B-152 cannon with a tractor. In addition, it were destroyed on the pontoon, the BTR-82A, all-terrain vehicle, car, infantry combat vehicle or truck that pulled the M100B. Part of the vehicle has been hit by the FPV drones, the rest is probably a gun artillery, which is evidenced by the characteristic fissures from the explosions. It is not reported which river the Russian troops were trying to force. Supposedly, we are talking about the Zherabets River, which flows in the area of Zerchnya and Torskoy settlements. This, of course, does not mean that the Ukrainian defense forces are doing well in the Lyman direction. And suddenly, the Ukrainian military officer Stanislav Bunyatov describes the situation in the following way. In the forests in the Lyman direction, Russian armed forces intensified their advance, he writes. Russian has a lot of infantry. FPV drones are not everywhere effective in such conditions. Much more useful are bombers and cassettes, which we do not have so much now. In addition, some brigades have not yet pumped their Rapaki, a company of strike and unmanned aerial systems, which the enemy regularly suppresses their positions, admits Bunyatov. Meanwhile, the first results of the work of a new core system appeared in Ukrainian armed forces. Journalist Yuri Budusov says that in the area of responsibility of the 3rd Assault Corps at the junction of the Lymansky and Kupinsk directions, since the corps was put into operation in early June, the enemy's pace of advance sharply dropped from about 40 to 10 square kilometers per month. And the losses in the divisions decreased by 2, despite the fact that in June the intensity of Russian attacks increased. He sees the reason in the competent defense organization, the refusal of pointless counterattacks, the resumption of the regular replenishment of personnel and ammunition, and the work of experienced personnel who left the 3rd Assault Unit. It turns out that the idea of forming corps around those who proved their effectiveness of the brigade gave its fruits, and let's hope that the same effect will be observed in other directions. And it is logical that this is happening, because you just make a large organizational structure that is controlled by those who know what to do. Well, that is, of course, you can crumble, that this is happening only now, because bad interaction between the divisions and the lack of control at the organizational level is the claim that Ukrainian military and Ukrainian analysts have repeatedly made over the past 3.5 years, claims that have been presented to the Ukrainian command, let's call it that. Finally, this problem is being solved, and I hope that we will see the growth of efficiency in the same way as it happens with this corps. Because in the Ukrainian army there are a huge number of talented people who understand this war, understand how to win it, and understand what needs to be done for this. And Ukraine has recently made a lot of effort to ensure that these people can really control the process, including the appointment of Magyar in the unmanned forces as a head of the unmanned systems. In general, I hope that this trend will only accelerate and that it will bear fruit, because we see how Ukraine can win in this war. This is a clear way through which you just have to go nowhere. Recently, Russian armed forces apparently decided to accelerate the sluggish frontal offensive on Siversky. Finally, but the end of this turned out to be a bit predictable. The Project War Archive describes the corresponding video as follows. At the joint efforts of 2 brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine, a large-scale Russian assault was repelled in which 6 tanks, 3 armored personnel carriers, 6 tractors, 12 light vehicles, 2 buggy, and 41 motorcycles were used. According to preliminary calculations, 48 Russian soldiers were destroyed and 69 were wounded. Enemy losses are being clarified. The battles took place in the region of Verkhnekamensko, the southwestern village of Zolotovka, and the village of Verkhnekamensko. The events took place a couple of days ago, but interesting details continue to come up. Monitoring channel Infactum pays attention to the scene of a tank duel, which is rarely seen in modern times. The Russian tank successfully enters the Russian tank with the Tsar Mangel. As it is said, the armored caravan retreated, but was finished off by FPV drones. What else pays attention to itself? The armored caravan does not take any action, except in fact, attempts to crawl back. You worked so carefully on the protection of your tank from drones that it can no longer fight other tanks. The American veteran of Ukrainian armed forces, nicknamed Spaghetti Cossack, is ironic in Twitter. In fact, this is the problem of the evolution of Russian tanks. Sacrifice of protection from drones brings everything. Mobile situational awareness, which in Russian tanks never stood out, repairability, try to imagine how the engine of this shed changes, and often firepower when the tank is simply removed tower and placed there a department for airborne. Not that it was a completely ineffective combat vehicle. On such monsters, sometimes you have to make dozens of FPV drones. It's just not a tank, but more likely a heavy breakthrough armored personnel carrier, which the Russian army doesn't have and hopefully won't have anytime soon. Deep State records the advance of the Russians in the south of the Donetsk region in the Green Guy, as well as in the area of Podobny and Andriivka Cliffs Savova. Map of the project is marked by the Soviet name Iskrat. Fud, not to spoil it, but it seems to me that the pace of the offensive of Russian armed forces in this direction has lost its crisis nature. Let me remind you, they still have not managed, no matter how seriously, to go over the Dnipropetrovsk region. The crisis really passed in this area, whether it is or not, we will find out in the coming weeks. Then it is possible that this is due to the introduction of another army corps of Ukrainian armed forces, the 20th, which, as reported at the end of June, replaced the tactical group Ugledar. In this direction, there were a lot of claims from the same Deep State. If we talk about the speed of the Russian army's advance in Ukraine, then it stopped growing. The Russian military captured 96 km2 in Ukraine in a week, and more than 500 since the beginning of July. This is evidenced by the analysis by the Agency of the Data of the Close Ukrainian Defense Ministry, OSIM project, and Deep State. The weekly rates were at the level of last week and significantly lower than the peak values of the beginning of July, and the monthly ones are comparable to the June and May ones, but at the expense of just the first weeks of July. This may be due to the fact that Russia now aims to take 2 cities at once, Kupinsk and Pokrovske. The Russian army continued to move to Pokrovske, where 41 square kilometers of territory passed under its control. To the south, where the Russian war is coming from the Great Novoselsk, in a week 27 square kilometers were captured. Another 18 were under Russian control in the Kupinsk region of the Kharkov region. Russian troops are trying to surround Pokrovske, Kupinsk, and Konstantinovka, according to the Deep State map. It should be noted that the South Donetsk direction, which was considered the most critical for the defense forces a couple of weeks ago, stopped yielding the greatest gains in captured territory. Does this mean that the situation there is stabilizing? We will see in the next week. In the late July, the Russian army captured 502 SQ km, almost the same as it was occupied in June, 541 SQ km. At the same time, the pace of advance in recent weeks indicates a slowdown in the Russian offensive after the record-breaking first week of July, when the Russian military captured the maximum area of the middle of November, 225 SQ km. The speed of capture of new territories began to decrease. In the second week of July, the Russian army took 158 SQ km on the week from July 14 to July 2092. The slowdown in the speed of advance of the Russian army may be due to the fact that it is now concentrated on cutting off large settlements. Pokrovske and Kupiansk, said the agency and the single analyst Kirill Mikhailov. Flanking maneuvers do not result in large areas of captured territory, but in the event of success and the retreat of the Ukrainian forces from one or another pocket, the advance is accelerated due to the occupation of its territories by the Russian forces. If the battles along the supply lines of Kupiansk and Pokrovsk turn out unfavorably for Ukraine, one can expect an acceleration of the Russian armed forces' advance in the future, said Mikhailov. As I said, due to the fact that Deep State, for its own reasons, publishes data on Russian promotion not quite in real time, it makes sense to consider a trend that will last for at least 2 weeks. In fact, for the last 2 weeks we have observed the return of the tempo, characteristic of most of the Russian summer offensive, except for 2 short-term splashes of activity in May and July due to advance in Sumchina and in the south of Donetsk, respectively. Russia continues to advance at a pace several times faster than during the relative lull from January to mid-May, but at the same time it still cannot develop tactical success in the operational and move quickly and deeply beyond the line of the Ukrainian front. This is precisely the main goal of the Russian command, which we hope to talk about in the coming days, with a revolutionary thought that Russia is not leading the war on exhaustion. You could see it in a recent video, but I liked it so much that I think we should stay on this in more detail, and this greatly changes the perception of this war and, let's say, its perspective. It would seem that the developing operational crises in the Pokrovske-Kupiansk region should inspire this community. However, they regularly remind us of the price of Russian success at the front and why it remains so high. It is worth quoting in full the post by Russian serviceman Svyatoslav Golikov, whose writings stand out for their most systematic analysis of the problems within the Russian army. Enemy, he writes, fixates the front landing immediately in several directions and, as one of the main reasons, indicates a significant advantage in the number of combat-capable infantry as part of the strike groups of the Russian troops immediately in several operational directions, Golikov writes. This advantage is greatly ensured by the mobilization problems of the enemy itself. At the same time, the enemy makes a serious effort to compensate for the lack of a human component in infantry units by unmanned means, Golikov reports. I told you in my video about the war of the future, which is already going on now. Look, this is, to be honest, one of the most fundamental works of this year, it seems to me. Well, in general, if you missed, look. Let's go back to Golikov. The enemy's shortage of combat-ready infantry, combined with the fragmented nature of their defense, leads to the formation of gaps. While the strength of the unmanned systems to cover all these gaps is not enough for the enemy, and the remnants of our assault groups manage to slip through them, this is why the front line is giving way. A typical question from a comrade in private messages. Listen, what do you think? Is it all just stupidity or the army is being deliberately wasted? He asks about Russian side. Putting aside considerations on this topic, I note that this question comes not just from the ground, but from one of those very directions where the enemy is facing operational crises. Overall, this is to understand the actual cost of our operational successes. The enemy's ongoing drone lines project is currently aimed at inflicting heavy losses on our active personnel, wearing down our numbers faster than reinforcements arrive, and, as a result, at reducing the numerical disparity as much as possible between our and the enemy ground forces, writes Golikov. The enemy is directly aided in achieving these goals by the reckless waste of our human resources. Vast number of commanders, from senior officers to battalion and company commanders, are afflicted by a distorted paradigm of thinking, which absolutizes the principle of war: there are no battles without losses. In practice, this is expressed in attitudes like, if you don't have 200s, you're not fighting well. Those will be lost and new ones will be sent. Next, the enemy also makes a lot of effort to increase the level of training of their infantry, analyzes Golikov in the actions of Ukraine, including for offensive battles. In particular, as I have already mentioned above, in exercises, the immediate deployment of mechanized and motorized units into battle without prior concentration is being tested. Under conditions of highly dispersed combat formations, this tactic can be effective both in active defense and in offense. Even in current conditions, a lack of infantry and a failure of defense in a range of operation directions, Ukraine retains the capability to deliver quite significant counterattacks. A clear example of what the difficult situation on the Sumy front illustrates. In this case, in the full implementation of the Line of Drones project, the enemy will not only reduce the specified number of disproportions, but also provide conditions for deep counterattacks. Details about the philosophy of the drone line project and its practical implementation, again, can be found in another my video. Perhaps there are no topics in this war that I would not release a video about, but in fact, this is the work. To expect, Golikov continues, that the enemy will collapse before being able to secure such conditions is, to put it mildly, irrational. Meanwhile, there is no systematic approach to solving the problem of fighting with meat is still not observed. On the contrary, the higher military political leadership seems to be in a kind of a dopamine trap. The current fall of the defense of the enemy, that is, Ukraine, only exacerbates the situation of distorted reality. Golikov here describes that offensive for the sake of the offensive, which, as I said in another video recently, lies outside the logic of the war on exhaustion, since the KPI is counted in kilometers and flashlights and not in the number of the destroyed enemy. It is this aspect of how Russia is waging the war that we will discuss with you in a bit more detail in the coming days. In the meantime, I will give an opinion of Stanislav Bunyatov about why this tactic still brings results. The one who believes that the Russians have ceased to drive people to death is mistaken, Bunyatov writes. Russian armed forces have adapted. Instead of mass assaults with columns, now they work in pairs, 24/7, which are constantly moving towards our positions. Their goal is to exhaust our firepower. Although mass assaults with columns also happen, as we saw in the last days, I will add to myself. The constant need and the extremely attentive work by UAV operators and duty personnel at command posts, continues Bunyatov, the extremely difficulty in maintaining long-term concentration and effectiveness, wear of equipment, fatigue of personnel, influence of weather conditions, all this plays against us. In the current conditions, every living Russian who passed unnoticed or was left without attention is a potential threat to the stability of positions. The biggest problems arise in the lines of the brigade, which technically cannot control their zone of responsibility, Bunyatov notes. Indeed, the purpose of this constant pressure is to search for weak points in the Ukrainian defense along the entire front line and develop success in these areas. However, these successes come at the cost of enormous losses in areas where Ukrainian defenses are put to the test. The author of the channel Ubeshchno 8, mobilized by the Russian military, talks about these losses. Here's what he writes about the loss in the offensive, evaluation of the success of the enemy chiefs. In another conversation the other day, I remembered the academic data about level of losses where a unit is considered to have lost combat readiness and to require withdrawal for replenishment. If I remember correctly, once a 30% personnel loss is reached, an assault company should be pulled back for replenishment in order to preserve the unit's experienced core. This is by Clausewitz, it seems. The channel's author apparently hasn't read Clausewitz either, just like the Russian commanders, because the German theorist never gave exact figures anywhere. He was generally against all sorts of mathematical and geometric statements of the introduction of war, considered warfare not a science but an art. That is, by Clausewitz, the military chief must feel when the losses are too big to continue the offensive. And Russian commanders have never had such a feeling, and there is only a meaningless obedience to a pointless order. But let's go back to the mobilized from the shelter number 8. At 50% of losses, he writes, the unit is considered defeated, requires immediate withdrawal for replenishment. The SVO has struck us with new standards of losses, which someone has confirmed. For example, in our unit, it was 70% of those who lost their combat ability. Only then did the Storm Company withdraw from the battle. And in the case of the White Cuirassier from the CVO, the periods from October 23 to March 24, according to the volunteer admin, infantry in the companies were worn down by 90–95%, until only the command element remained from the assault company. In both cases, if we compare the very well-founded classic of military art, the wearing down of the Storm Company to such a state is an assumption of the defeat of the advancing unit. Once again, 70–95% of losses are the defeat of the unit with the destruction of the combat-capable corps, who at least learned something for 14, now 21 days of training and took part in the first battles. That is, based on the classics of the war theory, Colonel Mesnik performs the task of permitting multiple destructions of his assault units. An interesting question, how many destroyed Ukrainian defending units were on N of our destroyed assault units under that Avdiivka? What is the proportion? Asks this question. Colonel Mesnik prevents the transfer of combat experience to assault units due to the omission of the death of those who have experienced real battles. After receiving the replenishment, the colonel is led by newcomers every time who have not smelled the gunpowder. The bloody bravado in the style of "I killed 5 storm squads for this village" started to sound interesting, isn't it? Okay, there are some blockers from the cart discussing the modern commanders, but the same Clausewitz and other classic theorists of military art, they also need to go south. How will future generations evaluate this experience of SVO? He wonders. The question, of course, is rhetorical, but most likely this war will be considered as one of the most senseless and shameful wars in Russian history, along with the Crimean or Soviet-Finnish War. The Kiev School of Economics published an extremely interesting study based on the data of the Russian railway transports, which shows that Russia is sending less and less military cargo to the front line. According to the study, railway deliveries to frontline destinations have tripled in the period from 2021 to 2023. However, in 2024, more than 25% fell. Apparently, in 2025, the drop in supplies will continue. In particular, the sending of other goods, under which most often armored vehicles and other weapons are taken, from 30 railway stations located close to the Russian bases. tons. The storage of equipment in 2022 doubled in comparison with 2021, from 113 to 242,000 tons. In 2023, it dropped to 9, in 2024 to 29, and the data on January-April of this year allows to assume that in 2025, the supplies from the storage base will fall by 24, almost to the pre-war level, consisting of 119,000 tons. At the same time, Russia is increasingly relying on the help of the DPRK. In 2024, the supplies of explosive substances from there to the famous Russian arsenal were 52% of the total amount. Also, researchers found out that almost half of the supplies of goods from the DPRK came from logistic companies serving the Russian defense industry. In the study, it is emphasized that these companies are most often not under sanctions due to their formal civilian status. This study is extremely important not only because it shows the tendency to exhaust the Russian army due to the drop in supplies, but also because it points out the targets for Ukrainian drones at the front stations that take these very goods. As well as for foreign sanctions, we are talking about those very logistical companies that actually represent the bloody system of Russian defense and which have long been waiting for sanctions. Let me remind you that it is very important in the war on exhaustion not only to destroy as much as possible the enemy's weapons, but also to ensure that new weapons and supplies would enter the front as little as possible, and Ukraine is leading the war on exhaustion. Let's move on to the problem of small logistics. In Z Channel, 2 Maters showed how the Russian army now transports 152 artillery shells in motorcycle seat bags. This is the only chance to deliver ammunition not even to the front, but to the artillery positions in a few kilometers from the front. Because if you drive in the old-fashioned way, Ukrainian drones will inevitably arrange a beautiful firework on the trucks. The channel made a conclusion about the need to increase the production of OWN's motorcycles, but on these plans, immediately poured out the friendly channel mess of goodwill from cold water. And yes, they write their own, at the price of Lada Granta. Have you been watching for a long time how much a new Euro costs? They wrote there, making quick announcements where Russian motorcycles are priced at around 1.5 million rubles, more than $18,000. Moreover, in the same channel, they paid attention to the article, according to which in 2024 it was planned to collect only 700 euro. This is despite the fact that production used to be 1,200 motorcycles per year, but in 2023 it declined due to the same present sanctions. There were plans to increase production by relocating part of the manufacturing capacity to Kazakhstan. So even in the matter of frontline logistics, Russia is destined to remain dependent on its Chinese comrades for the foreseeable future. Folklore collector Ivan Filipov drew attention to several posts about widespread looting in the occupied city of Horlivka, carried out by individuals with a visual appearance resembling that of the Akhmat forces. Nothing unusual, just in Gorlovka there was a special agent Akhmatov who began to cheerfully demolish the apartments of local residents, writes Alex Parker Returns. People are boldly destroying apartments even if there are old people inside. Everything valuable is taken out. They also spend the night in these apartments. Work systematically and go around the house. As a result, the Gorovchans began to install surveillance cameras, write signs on the front doors that they live in apartments in the hope of scaring off the Chechens. Pippa, he writes, in one of the districts of Horlivka, unidentified individuals of Caucasian ethnicity are operating, breaking into apartments. People leave inscriptions living on the doors for their own safety, so as not to lose their housing, reports in the CHP Donetsk channel. The eyewitness reports that in Gorlovka, in addition to the looting of other people's apartments, unknown people of Caucasian nationality persistently come to the underage girls with a request to get acquainted, adds the public of the typical Donetsk. Should be noted here that Gorlovka is not some recently occupied city, from which almost all the population left, leaving abandoned apartments after themselves. This is not the justified scenario of marauding, just more familiar. Gorlovka has been under the control of the so-called separatists since 2014. But apparently the so-called Russian world has come full-fledged only now. We see marauders and the lack of water, about the last crisis that the Russian authorities, it seems, are not going to solve. You can watch my last video. War participant with a family of judges became a teacher of schoolchildren in Primorai, a problem that is not once spoken of. A resident of Ushariysk, Nikolai Vyzichkanish, who returned from Ukraine, lost his leg at the war front, conducts master classes for children and participates in the patriotic upbringing of young people. 7x7 paid attention on the program of the local TV channel. According to him, Vyzichkanish prepares schoolchildren for the military sport game Zornitsa and teaches them the basics of military medicine. At the same time, the man is a figurehead of the criminal case, hooliganism. In March of 1924, Vyzichkanish appeared with a ventilated machine gun on the parking lot of the mall Sedanka City in Vladivostok and reloaded weapons in a public place. Incident occurred the next day after the terrorist attacks in Crocos City Hall, after which people were evacuated from the mall and the soldiers of the Russian Guard arrived at the scene. According to police, 2 airsoft grenades were also confiscated from the man. In March 2025, the case was transferred to court. The prosecutor's office of Primorsky Krai confirmed that the accused has a criminal record. Vyzichkanish had previously been prosecuted 7 times, including for robbery, theft, and fraud. This is what I'm talking about all the time. You can do as much as you want. Being in Russia, nothing is happening. Here we have a lot of food in our stores and so on and other junk. But the fact is that your children are being taught by recidivists, repeat offenders who haven't served their full sentence. Repeat offenders who get something stuck in their heads and go to the shopping center armed, even if it's with a cold weapon. Well, these people cannot be allowed to go to children. These people cannot be allowed to go to anyone at all. They have to sit, but they work with your children. And how can these people take it? How, in response to this, they can say that everything is fine with us, everything is normal. I don't understand at all. Like, okay, you're ruining your life, but you can't ruin the lives of your children. They didn't choose it. Well, Michael Nacke was with you, and see you soon. All the best. Bye.